In the spaces between stars, where light takes centuries to complete its lonely journey, there exists a silence so profound that it predates thought itself. The ancient peoples who first mapped these voids believed the darkness held memory, that the universe itself was a witness, patient and eternal, recording every choice, every war, every extinction in the cold geometry of expanding space.
Talvaran sovereignty counselor Vormesh Talindra had lived for 3,412 cycles. She had watched stars born in the nurseries of nebulae and mourned their deaths in the violent poetry of supernovae. She had negotiated treaties with species whose very concept of time differed so fundamentally from her own that the act of conversation required years of preliminary philosophical groundwork. She had witnessed the rise and fall of 17 civilizations, each believing themselves eternal, each ultimately proven wrong by the indifferent arithmetic of entropy. And now, standing on the observation deck of the refugee vessel that carried what remained of her species, she understood with terrible clarity that she was about to witness the 18th. The Talvaran had ruled the sovereignty for 40,000 years. Their crystalline neural architecture allowed them to process information across timescales that lesser species could barely conceptualize. Their philosophy had shaped the ethical frameworks of 100 client races. Their technology had unlocked secrets that the cosmos seemed designed to hide forever. They had been the Council's eldest voice, its wisest counsel, its steady hand through crises beyond counting. None of it mattered now. Vormesh pressed her primary sensing appendages against the transparent barrier that separated her from the void, and watched the distant light of what had once been the Talvaran homeworld. It was a funeral pyre visible across light years, the death of everything her people had built, everything they had believed themselves to be. Somewhere in that fading glow, 14 billion of her kin had ceased to exist in the space between one heartbeat and the next.
"Counselor," the voice came from behind her, soft and deferential. Her aide, Kelthrin, approached with the hesitant movements of one delivering news they knew would wound. "The evacuation census has been completed."
Vormesh did not turn. How many?
The pause before his answer was its own kind of cruelty. 17 million. Across all surviving vessels. 17 million out of 43 billion. She did the mathematics automatically, her crystalline mind unable to help itself. A survival rate of 0.04%. The Talvaran, who had existed since before most council species had developed written language, had been reduced to a rounding error.
The sovereignty fleet?
Destroyed. The Kethvaral system defense grid held for 18 hours before it was overwhelmed. The Void Singers. The reports suggest they did not pause to accept surrender. They did not respond to any diplomatic frequency. They simply continued their advance.
Vormesh closed her primary eyes, the 4 secondary ones remaining fixed on the distant light of her murdered world. The Void Singers. Even the name felt inadequate for what they were, a consuming absence that had emerged from the galaxy's edge 3 cycles ago, destroying everything in its path with weapons that defied the known physics of the universe. No demands, no communication, no apparent motivation beyond annihilation itself.
"Where are we going?" she finally asked.
Kelthren's hesitation was longer this time. The Council has authorized a request for sanctuary to a species outside our traditional sphere of influence.
Which species would accept refugees from a war that has already consumed 8 Council civilizations?
The humans, Counselor.
Vormesh turned then, her movement sharp with surprise she could not entirely suppress. The humans? We are fleeing to the humans?
They were the only species to respond to the Council's general distress call. Their representative indicated that they would accept any refugees who reached their borders.
The absurdity of it threatened to break something inside her. The humans, a species so young that their earliest radio transmissions had only just begun reaching the near stars. A species that the Council had formally classified as pre-emergence less than 4 centuries ago, judging them too primitive and too dangerous for integration into galactic civilization.
A species that had been denied membership, denied technology transfers, denied even the basic recognition of sapient status, until they had somehow, impossibly, developed faster than light travel on their own.
The Talvaran had led the Council vote to quarantine humanity's home system. Vormesh herself had spoken eloquently about the dangers of allowing a species with such a violent history access to the technologies that made interstellar war possible. She had called them barely evolved predators, too tribal and too short-lived to grasp the consequences of the forces they were attempting to master.
And now she was fleeing to their space, begging for sanctuary.
How long until we reach their borders? 14 hours. We have received confirmation that a human delegation will meet us at their outer marker station. 14 hours. Vormesh turned back to the observation window, watching the stars slide past in their ancient, indifferent dance. 14 hours to compose herself. 14 hours to prepare for the humiliation of asking for help from a species she had publicly dismissed as insignificant barely 2 centuries ago.
She wondered if any of them would remember.
She rather suspected they would.
The human station was not what Vormesh had expected. When the Talvaran had first detected humanity's emergence onto the galactic stage, their intelligence services had compiled extensive reports on human technology, culture, and psychology. The reports had emphasized the species' primitive origins, their chaotic political systems, their apparent inability to maintain peace even among themselves.
The technology assessments had been almost dismissive. Human ships were inefficient, their weapons crude, their understanding of fundamental physics several centuries behind Council standard.
The station that now filled the observation window told a different story.
It was not beautiful. That was the first thing Vormesh noticed. Council stations were typically works of art, designed to project the power and sophistication of their builders through elegant lines and harmonious proportions. This human structure was brutally functional, a massive cylinder of gray metal and exposed infrastructure, every surface covered with sensor arrays, weapon emplacements, and what appeared to be modular attachment points for additional systems.
It looked like something that had been built to survive, not to impress.
"They call it Threshold Station," Kelthrin said softly. "It marks the boundary of what they consider their core territory. According to our records, it was constructed only 40 years ago, after the Council rejected their 3rd application for membership."
40 years, Vormesh murmured. The Talvaran sovereignty seat had taken 3 centuries to construct. This station was larger. The refugee vessel slowed as it approached, and Vormesh watched smaller craft emerge from the station's docking bays. Not warships, but what appeared to be medical and logistics vessels, already moving to intercept the other refugee ships in their convoy. She counted 17 of them before she stopped, the efficient precision of their movements unsettling in its coordination. "They are hailing us," Calthrin announced. "Audio only. Their representative wishes to speak with you directly."
Vormesh straightened, arranging her sensory appendages in the formal configuration of diplomatic reception. "Open the channel."
The voice that emerged from the ship's communication system was calm and measured, speaking the Council's common language with an accent that Vormesh could not quite place. Counselor Vormesh Talindra, this is Station Commander Elena Vasquez of Threshold Station. On behalf of humanity, I welcome you and your people to our space. We have prepared medical facilities, temporary housing, and provisions for all 17 million refugees currently en route to our borders.
If you would be willing, I would like to meet with you personally once your vessel has docked.
The message was simple, direct, and entirely lacking in the elaborate formalities that typically characterized first contact between Council species. There was no assertion of status, no subtle positioning for advantage, no reminder of past grievances, just a statement of facts and an invitation.
Vormesh found herself uncertain how to respond.
Commander Vasquez, she finally said, the Talvaran sovereignty thanks humanity for its generosity. I would be honored to meet with you once our people have been safely received.
Of course, Counselor. Take whatever time you need. We'll be here. The channel closed, and Vormesh stood in the sudden silence of the observation deck, trying to process what had just occurred. She had expected suspicion. She had prepared for recriminations, for demands, for the settling of old scores. The Talvaran had spent 2 centuries blocking humanity's integration into galactic civilization. Now, humanity held the lives of 17 million Talvaran in their hands, and their representative had responded with hospitality. It's a tactic, she said, more to herself than to Kelthrin. They want something. They must want something. But even as she spoke the words, she was not certain she believed them.
The meeting room where Commander Vasquez received her was as functional as the station itself. A simple space with a large table, comfortable chairs, and wide windows overlooking the docking bay where Talvaran refugees were being processed with remarkable efficiency. Vormesh watched them for a moment before turning her attention to the human who rose to greet her.
Elena Vasquez was older than Vormesh had expected. Her dark hair shot through with gray, her face marked by lines that spoke of years spent carrying heavy responsibilities. She was not tall by human standards, and there was nothing physically imposing about her presence, but her eyes, dark brown, almost black, held a quality that Vormesh recognized from her own reflection, the particular weariness of someone who had seen too much and carried on anyway.
Counselor, Vasquez said, extending her hand in the human gesture of greeting, thank you for coming. Vormesh had studied human customs enough to understand the gesture, though the physical contact was strange to her Talvaran sensibilities. She reciprocated as best she could, noting how the human's grip was firm but not aggressive, warm but not invasive.
Commander, your people's response to our crisis has been unexpected.
Unexpected? Vasquez gestured toward a chair, waiting until Vormesh had seated herself before taking her own place across the table. How so? Vormesh considered her words carefully. Diplomacy had been her profession for over 2,000 years, but she found herself uncertain of the correct approach with this human. The usual tools, flattery, subtle implication, strategic silence, seemed somehow inadequate. The Talvaran have not been kind to humanity, she finally said. We led the opposition to your species' integration into the Council. We argued that you were too dangerous, too primitive to be trusted with galactic technology and galactic responsibilities. We maintained that position for 2 centuries. Vasquez nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. I'm aware of the history, Counselor. Then you understand my confusion. You have every reason to turn us away, to demand concessions or apologies or something. Instead, you simply opened your doors.
The human was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the window where the refugee processing continued. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost contemplative. "Counselor, how old is your species? As a spacefaring civilization, I mean." 42,000 of your years, approximately. "And in all that time, have the Talvaran ever faced true extinction? Not political decline, not the loss of power or prestige, but genuine annihilation? The end of everything?" Vormesh felt something cold move through her crystalline neural network. No. Until 3 cycles ago, the possibility seemed theoretical.
Humanity has existed as a technological species for less than 400 years, Vasquez said. In that time, we have come within hours of extinction twice. The first time was before we ever reached the stars, a conflict among ourselves that nearly rendered our planet uninhabitable. The second was 70 years ago, when a gamma ray burst from a dying star passed close enough to our system to devastate 3 of our outer colonies.
She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a weight that Vormesh had not expected. "We know what it is to look into the void and see the end of everything we are. We know what it is to survive when survival seems impossible, and we know that when the darkness comes, the only thing that matters is whether someone is willing to reach out a hand. But we opposed you. We tried to keep you contained."
"You did." Vasquez's expression shifted, something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossing her features. "And I won't pretend that didn't hurt, Counselor. When you're young and alone in the universe and the ancient powers that should have been your guides instead slam the door in your face, yes, that hurt. But pain isn't a debt that needs to be repaid. It's a lesson."
And the lesson we learned was that we would have to build our own way, trust our own strength, and become something that didn't need the Council's permission to exist. She leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes meeting Vormesh's primary gaze directly. "The Council spoke first, Counselor. They spoke, and they said no. They said humanity was too dangerous, too young, too broken to deserve a place among the stars. And for 200 years we accepted that judgment. We stayed within the boundaries they set. We built quietly. We prepared." Prepared for what? The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment Vormesh saw something shift in Vasquez's expression, a flicker of something vast and patient, quickly suppressed. "For the day when the Council would need us," the human said simply. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have 17 million people to help settle. We can continue this conversation later, if you wish." She rose and extended her hand again. Vormesh took it, and this time the warmth of the human's touch felt less strange and more significant. As if something was being communicated that words could not quite capture. After Vasquez left, Vormesh remained at the window for a long time, watching the efficient ballet of human ships and personnel as they processed refugees with a speed and coordination that should not have been possible for such a young species. She counted the vessels, estimated the resources being deployed, calculated the logistical requirements. The numbers did not make sense. For a species that the Council had dismissed as primitive, humanity appeared to have resources that dwarfed what their official census suggested. The station alone represented an industrial capacity that the Talvaran intelligence services had believed decades away from human capability. And the way the personnel moved, the way the ships coordinated, there was a unity of purpose there that felt almost military in its precision.
What had humanity been building in its 2 centuries of isolation? What had they become?
The answer began to emerge 3 days later.
Vormesh had been given quarters in the station's diplomatic wing, comfortable, functional, and equipped with communication systems that allowed her to maintain contact with the other Talveran refugee groups scattered across human space. The reports she received painted a consistent picture. Wherever her people arrived, they found humans ready to receive them, not just willing, but prepared, with supplies and facilities that seemed to have been assembled in anticipation of exactly this crisis.
It was during her 4th conversation with Commander Vasquez that Vormesh finally asked the question directly.
How did you know we were coming?
They were seated in the same meeting room, sharing what Vasquez called coffee, a bitter human beverage that Vormesh found oddly soothing. The commander did not seem surprised by the question.
We've been monitoring the situation in council space for some time, she said. When the Void Singers first appeared, we recognized the threat pattern. Recognized it? Vormesh set down her cup. The Void Singers use technology that defies our understanding of physics. How could you possibly? Because we've seen something like it before. The words fell into the conversation like stones dropped into still water. Vormesh felt her crystalline matrix process them, reject them, process them again.
That's not possible. The Void Singers emerged 3 cycles ago. Before that, there was no record.
No record in council space, Vasquez agreed. But the galaxy is much larger than the council's sphere of influence. And humanity, during our centuries of isolation, had occasion to explore regions that the council had never mapped.
She rose and walked to the window, her posture carrying a weight that Vormesh was beginning to recognize. 73 years ago, one of our deep exploration vessels encountered the remains of a civilization in the outer reaches of the Sagittarius arm. They had been dead for approximately 800 years. Everything they had built, their cities, their ships, their technology, all of it had been systematically destroyed. The energy signatures matched nothing in our databases.
The Void Singers. We didn't have a name for them then. We called them the Silence. But yes, the same weapons, the same pattern of total annihilation, the same absolute refusal to communicate. Vasquez turned back to face her. We found 17 more dead civilizations over the next 4 decades, each one destroyed by the same force, each one more advanced than humanity was at the time of their death. Vormesh felt the cold spreading through her neural network again, deeper this time. You knew for 70 years that this threat existed, and you didn't warn anyone. We tried. There was no defensiveness in Vasquez's voice, only a kind of tired patience. We submitted our findings to the Council 41 years ago. The report was dismissed as human sensationalism. The Talvaran representative called it a transparent attempt to manufacture a crisis that would require Council resources to address, thereby forcing integration on unfavorable terms. The words hit Vormesh like a physical blow. She remembered that report. She remembered dismissing it herself, adding her voice to the chorus of skepticism that had buried the warning under layers of bureaucratic indifference.
Why didn't you push harder if you knew what was coming?
Would you have listened? The question was gentle, but it carried an edge. Counselor, humanity spent 200 years trying to earn a place at your table. Every time we offered something, technology, intelligence, alliance, it was rejected as either too primitive to be useful or too dangerous to be trusted. After a while, we stopped offering.
Then what did you do?
Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on something beyond the window, beyond the station, beyond the stars visible from this small corner of space.
We prepared. Over the following weeks, Vormesh began to understand just how inadequate that word was.
It started with small things: the efficiency of the refugee processing, the depth of human knowledge about Talvaran physiology and psychology, the way supplies arrived before they were requested, as if someone had anticipated every need before it arose. The Talvaran who had been distributed across human space reported similar experiences, not just acceptance, but integration, as if humanity had been waiting for them all along.
Then came the larger revelations.
The first was the ships. Vormesh had assumed that the vessels she'd seen at Threshold Station represented the bulk of humanity's military capacity, a modest fleet, by Council standards, sufficient for border defense, but hardly capable of projecting power across significant distances. She was wrong.
The truth emerged during a briefing that Commander Vasquez invited her to attend, a routine strategic update that Vasquez seemed to think she should witness. The holographic display showed human space in 3 dimensions, with fleet positions marked in blue.
There were so many blue markers.
"This doesn't match our intelligence estimates," Vormesh said, unable to keep the shock from her voice. The Council's assessment indicated that humanity possessed perhaps 300 military vessels. This shows
12,800 as of this morning's count, Vasquez said calmly. The Council's assessment was based on our public registry and visible construction activities. It did not account for the facilities in our outer territories. Outer territories?
The display shifted, zooming out to show a region of space that the Council's maps marked as uninhabited. The void between galactic arms, where stars were scarce and nothing of value was thought to exist. Except that now, in the human display, that void was filled with markers, stations, shipyards, mining operations, colonies.
We have been expanding into the outer reaches for 117 years, Vasquez said. The regions that the Council considered worthless, we considered safe. No one looked there. No one cared. It gave us room to grow.
Vormesh stared at the display, her mind racing through the implications. The population estimates alone were staggering. If humanity had been colonizing unmonitored space for over a century, their true numbers could be— She could not complete the calculation. She did not want to.
Why? She finally asked. Why hide all of this? What were you afraid of?
Vasquez turned to face her, and for the first time, Vormesh saw something behind the commander's calm exterior, a flash of old pain, quickly controlled. "You know why, Counselor. You were there when the Council debated what to do about humanity. You heard the arguments. Some species wanted to uplift us, yes, but others wanted to contain us, to limit our growth, control our access to resources, ensure that we never became a threat to the established order. The quarantine was meant to protect you as much as— The quarantine was meant to keep us weak." There was no anger in Vasquez's voice, only certainty. The Council looked at human history, our wars, our atrocities, our capacity for violence, and decided that we were too dangerous to be allowed to develop freely. So you put a fence around our cradle and told yourselves it was for our own good. She turned back to the display, her reflection ghostly against the field of blue markers. But you made a mistake, Counselor. You assumed that a species capable of the violence you feared would be incapable of the discipline required to hide it. You looked at our wars and saw chaos. You didn't see what those wars taught us.
And what was that?
That survival requires sacrifice. That unity is more powerful than division. That sometimes the greatest strength lies in patience. Vasquez's voice was soft, almost contemplative. Humanity learned to hide its true nature long before we reached the stars. We learned during centuries of conflicts that the ones who boasted were the ones who fell.
We learned that the truly dangerous power is the one that no one sees coming. She gestured, and the display shifted again, showing the current position of the Void Singer advance, a wave of darkness consuming council space, system by system, civilization by civilization. The Void Singers will reach the edge of human territory in approximately 47 days, Vasquez said. When they do, they will find us ready.
Vormesh looked at the display, at the wave of destruction that had already consumed the Talveran homeworld, the Kethferal Empire, the simming spheres of Mothan, and a dozen other civilizations that had stood for millennia. Then she looked at the blue markers representing human forces. "Ready?" she repeated. "You genuinely believe you can stop them?"
Vasquez smiled, a small, tired expression that held neither arrogance nor false modesty.
"Counselor, we've been getting ready for 73 years. Every ship we've built, every weapon we've developed, every alliance we've quietly formed with species the Council ignored, all of it has been preparing for this moment. The Void Singers have destroyed civilizations far older and more powerful than humanity, but those civilizations had something in common."
What? They had never truly faced extinction. They had never been tested by the kind of absolute desperation that forces a species to become something more than it was. They had grown comfortable, certain of their place in the universe. Vasquez's eyes met Vormesh's. Humanity has never been comfortable. We have always known that the darkness was waiting, and we have spent every moment of our existence learning how to fight it.
The weeks that followed were the strangest of Vormesh's long life.
She watched as human space transformed into something she had never seen before, not a civilization preparing for war, but a civilization that had been waiting for war its entire existence. The transition was seamless, almost organic, as if every element of human society had always contained this hidden purpose, dormant but ready. Civilian shipping lanes became military supply routes overnight. Industrial facilities shifted production without apparent disruption. Populations relocated with an orderliness that would have taken the Talvaran years to achieve. And through it all, there was no panic, no chaos, no breakdown of social order, just calm, methodical preparation. Vormesh found herself spending more time with Commander Vasquez, drawn by a need to understand that grew stronger with each passing day. The human answered her questions patiently, revealing layer after layer of the civilization that humanity had built in secret, the distributed manufacturing networks that could produce warships faster than the Council could count them, the research programs that had developed technologies the Council's best scientists would have declared impossible, the training regimens that produced soldiers capable of operating at levels that should have broken any biological mind.
"You've been at war before," Vormesh said one evening, as they watched a fleet of human vessels departing for the front lines. "Not just among yourselves. Something else."
Vasquez nodded slowly. 47 years ago, we encountered an automated defense network left behind by one of the civilizations the Void Singers destroyed. It was still active, still following its last orders: destroy any approaching vessel. We lost 3 colonies and 200,000 people before we found a way to shut it down.
The Council never knew.
The Council never asked. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a statement of fact. And we didn't tell them. By that point, we had learned that the Council saw humanity as a problem to be managed, not an ally to be trusted. Why would we share our struggles with those who wished us contained? Vormesh was quiet for a long moment. 3,000 years of diplomatic experience had taught her to recognize the shape of a conversation, to sense when words were leading somewhere significant. And this conversation was leading somewhere. She could feel it in the careful precision of Vasquez's responses, in the way the human seemed to be building towards something she was not quite ready to say.
"What happened after the defense network?" she finally asked.
We studied it, reverse-engineered what we could, and we realized that the Void Singers were not an anomaly. They were a pattern, a force that had been moving through the galaxy for millions of years, consuming everything in its path, leaving nothing behind but silence and ruins.
Millions of years? Vormesh felt her crystalline matrix struggle to process the timescale. That's not possible. The Council would have detected.
The Council occupies a small fraction of a single galactic arm. The Void Singers have destroyed civilizations across the entire galaxy. They move slowly by cosmic standards, hundreds of light years per millennium, but they never stop, and they never fail. Every species that has stood against them has been annihilated.
Then what makes you believe humanity will be different? Vasquez turned to face her, and in that moment, Vormesh saw something in the human's eyes that she had never seen before. Not confidence exactly, but something deeper. A certainty that seemed to come from somewhere beyond mere hope or calculation.
Because we're not fighting alone. Before Vormesh could ask what she meant, an alarm sounded throughout the station. Vasquez's expression shifted, becoming focused and intent.
"The Void Singers have accelerated their advance," she said, moving toward the command center. "They'll reach our first defensive line in 12 hours. 12 hours? The projection said 47 days.
They know we're here now. They know something is different about this target." Vasquez paused at the door, looking back at Vormesh with an expression that was almost gentle. "Would you like to watch, Counselor? I think you should see what happens next." The command center of Threshold Station was a cathedral of information, vast screens displaying data from thousands of sources across human space. Vormesh stood beside Vasquez on an observation platform overlooking the main floor, where hundreds of human officers worked with the silent efficiency she had come to expect. The main display showed the approaching Void Singer fleet, if fleet was even the right word. The enemy vessels were unlike anything in the Council's database, massive structures of impossible geometry, radiating energy signatures that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time. There were thousands of them, advancing in perfect formation toward the human defensive line. "They destroyed the Talvaran sovereignty fleet in 18 hours, Vormesh said softly. "The Kethvaral lasted 12. The Mothan spheres, 3.
"I know." Vasquez's voice was calm, almost contemplative. "We've studied every engagement. The Void Singers use weapons that bypass conventional defenses. They manipulate the quantum structure of matter itself, causing targets to simply cease to exist. No shield, no armor, no point defense can stop them."
"Then how?"
"Watch."
On the display, the human fleet moved to intercept. Vormesh counted the vessels, 2,000 perhaps, against an enemy that numbered in the tens of thousands. It seemed like suicide. The Void Singers fired first. Beams of impossible darkness lanced across space, each one carrying enough destructive force to unmake a capital ship. Vormesh had seen recordings of these weapons striking Council vessels, the way the targets simply vanished, leaving behind not even debris, just empty space where matter had once existed. But the human ships did not vanish. The beams struck their targets and bent, curved, redirected. For a moment, Vormesh's crystalline mind refused to process what she was seeing. The laws of physics that governed the universe did not allow for what was happening on that display. "We spent 40 years studying the remains of the civilizations the Void Singers destroyed," Vasquez said. "We found fragments of their research, incomplete,
damaged, but enough to understand what they had been trying to accomplish. They were developing defenses against the Voidsinger weapons. They failed because they didn't have enough time.
And humanity did?
Humanity had 73 years of warning that the Council chose to ignore. 73 years to complete the work that a dozen dead civilizations had started. Vasquez's voice carried a weight of history that Vormesh was only beginning to comprehend. We didn't do this alone. We found their research, honored their sacrifice, and finished what they began. On the display, the human fleet was advancing now, pushing into the Voidsinger formation. The enemy weapons continued to fire, but each shot was deflected, redirected, or simply absorbed by the strange fields that surrounded the human vessels. And then the humans began to return fire.
Vormesh had seen human weapons in the Council's databases, crude projectile systems, primitive directed energy weapons, nothing that should have posed a threat to a species that had destroyed 40,000 years of Talvaran civilization in less than a day. But what she saw now bore no resemblance to those records. The human weapons were not loud or spectacular. They did not fill space with dramatic explosions or brilliant flashes of light. They were precise, surgical, almost elegant in their efficiency. One moment a Voidsinger vessel existed, the next it simply stopped, not destroyed, but somehow negated, as if the universe had decided that it no longer belonged in that particular location. "What are those weapons?" Vormesh whispered.
Recursion cannons. They work on the same principles as the Voidsinger technology, but refined. The Voidsingers use brute force to tear apart the quantum structure of matter. Our weapons convinced that structure that it was never stable in the first place. Vasquez's expression was unreadable. Every civilization the Voidsingers destroyed contributed something to this moment. Their research, their theories, their dying attempts to find a solution.
We gathered all of it, synthesized it, and turned it into something that could fight back.
On the display, the battle was shifting. What had seemed like certain defeat was becoming something else, a coordinated assault that was pushing the Voidsinger fleet back, system by system, position by position. Human ships moved with a unity that seemed almost telepathic, each vessel knowing exactly where it needed to be, exactly when to fire, exactly how to support its neighbors.
How are they coordinating? Vormesh asked. The communication lag alone should make this impossible.
Quantum entanglement links. Every human ship, every station, every asset is connected through instantaneous communication networks that span our entire territory. Vasquez smiled slightly. Another gift from the dead. The Velthani consensus developed the technology 800 years ago. They were destroyed before they could deploy it on a large scale. We finished their work. Vormesh watched the battle unfold, her ancient mind struggling to process the implications of what she was witnessing. The Voidsingers had destroyed civilizations far older and more powerful than humanity. They had never been stopped, never even slowed. And now, a species that the Council had dismissed as primitive was doing what 40 millennia of galactic civilization had failed to accomplish.
How? She finally asked. How is this possible? You are so young. Your species has barely existed for the span of a Talvaran childhood. How could you have accomplished all of this?
Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the display where the Voidsinger fleet was breaking apart under human assault.
Because we knew we had to, she finally said. Counselor, the ancient species of the Council have never truly believed in their own mortality. You have lived so long, achieved so much, that the idea of genuine extinction seemed theoretical, an abstract concept, not a real possibility.
She turned to face Vormesh,
and her expression held a truth that was almost painful to witness. Humanity has never had that luxury. From the moment we became aware of the universe beyond our world, we understood that we were small, fragile, and utterly expendable in the cosmic scheme. We looked at the stars and saw not wonder, but danger, not opportunity, but threat. Every moment of our existence as a spacefaring species has been shaped by the knowledge that something out there could end us without effort or remorse.
So you prepared for the worst?
We prepared for everything. Vasquez's voice was soft, almost gentle. Every scenario, every threat, every possible enemy. While the Council debated whether we were worthy of membership, we were building the capacity to survive without it. While you dismissed our warnings about the Void Singers, we were developing the weapons to fight them. While you quarantined us and called us dangerous, we were becoming exactly what you feared, and more.
On the display, the Void Singer fleet had collapsed entirely. The surviving enemy vessels were fleeing, pursued by human ships that moved with relentless precision. In less than 3 hours, a force that had conquered 8 civilizations had been broken.
This is just the beginning, Vasquez said. The main Void Singer fleet is still out there, millions of vessels spanning multiple sectors. This was a vanguard sent to test our defenses. Now they know what we are, and they will respond.
But you've won, Vormesh said. You've proved that they can be stopped. We've won a battle. The war will take years, perhaps decades, and we will need help. Vasquez met her eyes directly. The Talvaran have knowledge, experience, and capabilities that humanity lacks. The other surviving Council species have resources and populations that could accelerate our efforts enormously. Alone, humanity can fight this war. Together, we can win it.
Vormesh understood then. The hospitality, the sanctuary, the revelation of human capabilities, all of it had been building toward this moment. Not a demand, not a negotiation, but an invitation.
You want the Council to join you.
I want every species that wants to survive to stand with us. The Council spoke first, Counselor. For 2 centuries they spoke, and their answer was no. Now it's time for a different voice to answer a different question.
Vasquez extended her hand, the same gesture of greeting she had offered when they first met. But now Vormesh understood its deeper meaning. Not just welcome, but partnership. Not just acceptance, but unity.
Will the Talvaran speak with us? Vasquez asked. Will you help us end this?
Vormesh looked at the hand, then at the display where human ships were systematically destroying the remnants of the enemy fleet. She thought about her people, 17 million survivors scattered across human space, their entire civilization reduced to refugees dependent on the charity of a species they had once dismissed as barbarians.
And she thought about the choice before her. The Council had spoken first, yes. They had spoken with arrogance and fear, and their words had nearly doomed the galaxy. Now humanity was offering something different, not vengeance for the wrongs done to them, but a chance to build something new.
Vormesh took the human's hand.
The Talvaran will speak, she said, and this time we will listen.
The war against the Void Singers lasted 18 years.
Vormesh lived through all of it, a witness to the greatest conflict the galaxy had ever known, and to the transformation that conflict wrought. She watched as species that had been enemies for millennia learned to fight side by side. She saw ancient prejudices crumble under the weight of shared survival. She observed humanity grow from a dismissed upstart to the coordinator of a galactic alliance that spanned more territory than the old Council ever had. and she saw the dead civilizations honored at last.
Every technology humanity deployed against the Void Singers carried the name of the species that had originally developed it. The shields were called Velfani barriers, the weapons were designated Korath lances and Shanmari disruptors and Temvori nullifiers. The communication networks bore the mark of species that had been extinct for centuries, their contributions finally recognized by the living.
We could not save them, Vasquez explained once, when Vormesh asked about the naming convention, but we could remember them. We could ensure that their final gift to the universe was not forgotten.
The war was not easy. Billions died, human and alien alike. Entire systems were lost, worlds rendered uninhabitable, fleets destroyed in battles that lasted weeks. The Void Singers were ancient beyond comprehension, their resources seemingly infinite, their determination absolute. They had never been stopped before, and they did not accept defeat easily.
But humanity did not fight alone anymore. The alliance that formed around them was the largest in galactic history, encompassing species that had never before cooperated, technologies that had never been combined, strategies that had never been attempted. And at the heart of it all was the quiet, relentless determination of a species that had spent its entire existence preparing for exactly this moment. The final battle occurred in a system that had no name, around a star that had never been mapped. The main Void Singer fleet had retreated there, consolidating its remaining forces for one last assault. The Allied fleet followed, representing every surviving species in the known galaxy. Vormesh was present for the battle. She had insisted, against the advice of every Talvaran who still valued her safety. After 18 years of war, she needed to see it end.
The Allied fleet numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Talvaran analytical ships coordinated with Kethvaral assault cruisers. Mothan sphere vessels provided long-range support, while human carriers served as the backbone of the formation. Dozens of other species contributed what they could: ships, weapons, minds willing to fight.
Against them stood the last of the Void Singers. Millions of vessels, the remnants of a force that had consumed civilizations for eons. They fought with the fury of a species facing its own extinction, deploying weapons and tactics that pushed the limits of what the Alliance could withstand. But they were no longer fighting alone against divided, unprepared victims. They were fighting against a galaxy that had finally learned to stand together. The battle lasted for 3 days. Vormesh watched from the command center of a human flagship, standing beside Commander Vasquez. No, Admiral Vasquez now, her dark hair fully gray, her face marked by years of war. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say.
On the 3rd day, the last Void Singer vessel was destroyed.
The silence that followed was unlike anything Vormesh had ever experienced. For a moment, the universe itself seemed to pause, acknowledging the significance of what had occurred. A threat that had haunted the galaxy for millions of years was finally, completely ended.
And then the celebrations began. Vormesh did not celebrate. She stood at the observation window of the flagship, looking out at the debris field that marked humanity's greatest victory. Beside her, Vasquez stood in similar silence. "You were right," Vormesh finally said, "all those years ago when you tried to warn us. The report the Council dismissed. You were right about everything."
It doesn't matter now.
It matters to me. Vormesh turned to face the human who had become, against all expectation, her closest friend. The Council spoke first, and we spoke wrongly. We let fear and arrogance blind us to the truth. If we had listened, if we had helped instead of hindered.
Then you wouldn't be the Talvarin. Vasquez's voice was gentle. Your caution, your skepticism, your careful consideration of every option, those are the qualities that allowed your species to endure for 40,000 years. You made mistakes, yes, but you also survived long enough to correct them.
With your help.
With everyone's help. Vasquez looked out at the debris field, at the ships of 100 species slowly organizing for the long journey home. That's the lesson, Counselor. That's what this war taught us all. No species, no matter how old or powerful or advanced, can face the darkness alone. We survive together, or we fall separately.
Vormesh nodded slowly, processing the words with her ancient crystalline mind. In 3,000 years of diplomatic experience, she had never encountered a species quite like humanity. They were stubborn, unpredictable, and capable of violence that made the Talvarin look timid by comparison. But they were also capable of a generosity that seemed to come from somewhere deep in their collective soul, a willingness to reach out even to those who had wronged them, to build bridges instead of walls.
"What happens now?" she asked. "Now we rebuild. The galaxy is scarred, and it will take generations to heal the damage. But for the first time in millions of years, there is no Voidsinger threat lurking in the darkness. The civilizations that survived this war have a chance to build something lasting, something that includes every species willing to contribute."
And humanity? What role will you play in this new order?
Vasquez smiled, a tired expression, but genuine. The same role we've always played, Counselor. We'll be here, watching, preparing, making sure that if the darkness ever returns, we're ready to face it together. She turned back to the observation window, her reflection ghostly against the stars.
"The Council spoke first," she said softly. "They spoke from fear, from prejudice, from the certainty that they knew better than anyone else what the universe required. And for 200 years, humanity listened to that judgment in silence. We built, we prepared, we waited." Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of everything they had endured. And then, when the moment came, humanity spoke last, and the universe will never forget what we said. Centuries later, long after Elena Vasquez had passed and Vormesh had finally surrendered to the entropy that claims all things, historians would debate the meaning of the war against the Voidsingers. They would analyze the strategies, dissect the technologies, and argue endlessly about what might have been done differently. But the stories that endured were simpler. They spoke of a young species, dismissed and quarantined, that had spent 2 centuries preparing in silence. They spoke of ancient civilizations, proud and powerful, brought low by their own arrogance, and saved by those they had scorned. They spoke of unlikely friendships forged in the fires of war, of enemies who became allies, of a galaxy that learned at last to stand together. And they spoke of a truth that the war had revealed, a truth that humanity had always known, even when no one else would listen. That the darkness is always waiting. That survival is never guaranteed.
And that the species that speaks last speaks loudest.
In the great memorial hall that stood at the heart of the new Galactic Union, a simple plaque bore the words that had become the defining motto of the post-war era. They were carved in every language known to sapient life, a reminder of the lesson that had cost so much to learn. The Council spoke first. Humanity spoke last. Let us never forget the price of speaking wrongly, nor the grace of those who answered anyway. And beneath those words, in the small, precise script that humans favored, a single additional line.
We were always listening. We were always ready. We always will be.
The stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent as ever to the struggles of those who lived among them. But in the spaces between those stars, where light took centuries to travel and silence had once seemed eternal, there was now something new.
There was hope. And there was humanity, standing watch in the darkness, ready to speak again if the universe ever required it.
Because that was what they had always been. Not the loudest voice, nor the oldest, nor the most powerful, just the most patient, the most prepared, the most willing to wait, to endure, to sacrifice everything for the moment when their voice would finally be heard.
The Council had spoken first.
Humanity had spoken last. And in the end, that had made all the difference.